The road from Charleston to Savannah stretched endlessly beneath the gray sky of early spring. It was 1844, and Genevieve Duffrain sat quietly in the carriage that carried her toward her new home, the humid air heavy with the scent of salt and moss. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like ghostly veils, swaying in the breeze as though whispering secrets to anyone willing to listen. She was newly wed to Edward Duffrain, a man of wealth and reputation, heir to one of the most prosperous cotton dynasties in Georgia. On paper, it was the perfect union, an alliance between two powerful families, the Duffrains and the Bellamys, meant to secure influence and fortune for generations to come. But behind the polished facade of the marriage certificate and the smiling congregation at St. John's Episcopal Church, there lingered a darker truth, one not written in the parish records. The journals of her lady's maid, Sarah Thompson, later uncovered decades later, spoke of the vacant look in Genevieve's eyes as she repeated her vows. She said the words, the maid wrote, but her gaze passed through the church window as if searching for something beyond. The Duffrain estate, known as Whitfield Plantation, rose from the Georgia soil like a monument to wealth and silence. The main house was immense, 3 stories tall, 22 rooms in all, its white columns gleaming against the encroaching dusk. The surrounding land stretched for more than 800 acres, a vast expanse of cotton fields and shadowed groves maintained by the labor of 73 enslaved men, women, and children. Their names were written carefully in a leather-bound ledger that Edward kept locked in his study. Each line was a life reduced to columns of ink: name, age, task, price. It was said that the Duffrain cotton fetched the highest price in Savannah's markets. Few asked why. Fewer still wanted to know. When Genevieve first stepped into the house that would become her prison, the air felt heavy and unmoving. Though the season outside had begun to bloom, inside Whitfield everything remained stale, trapped in the shadow of Edward's late mother, who had died 3 years earlier. The house had since been kept alive only by routine. Linens washed, silver polished, rooms swept but never truly lived in. Edward himself was often absent, dividing his time between the fields and his warehouse in Savannah proper. He left before dawn and returned well after sunset, his mind consumed by ledgers and trade. The addition of a wife, he wrote to a business associate that spring, should bring order to the household, allowing me to focus entirely on affairs of profit. For Genevieve, the days passed in silence. Servants moved through corridors like ghosts, speaking only when spoken to. She ate her meals alone, sat in rooms too large for one person, and wrote letters to her sister in Charleston that spoke more of loneliness than love. I find myself surrounded by walls that neither hear nor answer, she confessed in one, discovered more than a century later during a renovation. It is as if I have married into stillness. It was during those months of isolation that Genevieve first noticed him. From the second-floor window of her bedroom, she could see the stables, long, low buildings bordering the main drive. Among the workers tending to the horses, one man drew her attention. His name was Noah Langston. The plantation's purchase records from 1842 described him in dry accounting terms. Prime field hand, 26 years of age, reads and writes, price $1,200. Nothing in that entry hinted at who he truly was. Years later, abolitionist testimonies revealed that Noah had not been born into slavery at all. He had grown up free in Philadelphia, educated, literate, and hopeful until the day he was kidnapped and sold south into bondage. By a twist of fate or cruelty, he had been sold to Whitfield. His intelligence had not gone unnoticed. Though initially assigned to field labor, he was soon moved to the stables after showing an uncanny skill with horses. There, within Genevieve's view, his quiet grace set him apart. She began to watch him. Her diary, recovered from a secret compartment in her writing desk in 1954, revealed the slow unraveling of curiosity into fascination. There is something in his eyes, she wrote on a humid June evening. They carry a light I have never seen in this place. When he believes himself unseen, he stands taller, freer, as though remembering another life. That summer, Genevieve developed a sudden interest in riding. She requested that Noah personally prepare her horse each morning, despite the impropriety of such direct contact. Plantation custom dictated that he accompany her rides at a careful distance, ostensibly for her safety. The arrangement gave them stolen fragments of freedom, hours spent beneath the canopy of oaks where words could be spoken, without fear of being overheard. What began as casual conversation soon deepened. One morning in August, Noah let slip a mention of Philadelphia, a word that hung in the air like forbidden fruit. He quickly tried to recover, but it was too late. She had heard it, and the knowledge that he had once lived free changed everything. "Our eyes met," she wrote that night, "and I understood more in that single glance than in all the months of marriage." By autumn, Genevieve found reasons to keep Noah close. She asked him to repair the shutters, move furniture, deliver books. The house slaves whispered warnings, especially Martha, the head house servant who had seen too many such dangers unfold. "Keep your distance," she told Noah, "or neither of you will see spring." Edward, meanwhile, remained oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind. His attention was fixed on his failing finances. Cotton prices were falling, and letters from his banker grew increasingly sharp. One, dated September 10, 1844, advised him to reduce household expenses and consider the sale of superfluous assets, including redundant servants. It was during this time of tension that Genevieve made her boldest move. According to an account later published anonymously in 1861, she confronted Noah in the stables one rainy evening. "She asked me of my life before Whitfield," Noah's account read. "When I hesitated, she said she already knew. She saw in me the manner of a man not born in chains. She offered to teach me to read again, to read better books," she said, "books of truth." What Noah did not know was that Genevieve had already found evidence of his northern birth in her husband's private papers. Among Edward's correspondence was a letter from the trader who had sold Noah, warning that the man had been improperly taken from the north and advising discretion in his handling. Throughout the cooling days of autumn, they met in secret within the library under the pretense of household business. She would read aloud poetry, philosophy, and he would listen, absorbing every word like a man starved for light. "He carries words as others carry wounds," she wrote, carefully, reverently, and with pain. Their secret ended abruptly on November 12th. Edward returned unexpectedly from a business trip to find Genevieve reading while Noah stood nearby. The sight enraged him. That evening, the Plantation ledger recorded a cold entry. "Disciplinary action required. Slave Noah reassigned to field gang effective immediately." The real punishment was far worse. 20 lashes carried out under the overseer's watch, a brutal warning to others. For 2 weeks afterward, Genevieve's diary fell silent. When she resumed, her handwriting had changed, tight, deliberate, controlled. "I have caused suffering," she wrote. "I will remember my place." But the silence between them could not hold. In early December, illness swept through the kitchen house, and Noah was brought back temporarily to assist inside the main residence. As Christmas approached, he helped decorate the halls, carrying pine boughs and candles. On the evening of December 18th, Martha saw Genevieve slip a folded note into his hand. Hours later, Edward found that same note among her writing papers, a half-finished plan outlining Noah's escape north. With Genevieve's assistance, that night, everything unraveled. Noah was locked in the equipment shed under guard to be dealt with at dawn. Genevieve was confined to her bedroom, the door bolted from the outside. The house fell into a tense stillness broken only by Edward's pacing footsteps below. Shortly after midnight, Martha heard him leave. Then came the shouting, a scuffle, and finally the crack of a single gunshot echoing through the rain. By morning, the official story had already taken form. Noah had escaped, attacked his master, and fled into the darkness. A reward notice appeared 3 days later in the Savannah Republican, warning that the fugitive was dangerous and cunning. No mention was made of Genevieve's involvement. But Martha's hidden notes told another version. "Mistress was seen on the back stairs," she wrote. "When master left, she followed. I believe she opened the lock herself." In the days that followed, Genevieve retreated into silence. At the annual Christmas dinner, she appeared immaculate but pale, her voice soft, her gaze hollow. Edward played the gracious host, raising toasts and laughter, as though nothing had happened. The truth might have died with them all had it not been for what was found years later, in the ruins of the old plantation. When a journalist visited the abandoned Whitfield property in 1868, he stumbled upon a collapsed shed. Inside a wall cavity, he discovered a rusted tin box containing a water-damaged journal. The handwriting inside, though faint, belonged unmistakably to Noah Langston. The entries told a shocking truth. Noah was not simply an escaped slave, but Edward Duffrain's half-brother. Their father, Elijah Duffrain, had once owned property in Pennsylvania, where he fathered a son with an enslaved woman before moving south and building his empire in Georgia. Noah, raised free, had inherited his father's intellect and ambition, but not his protection. When he was kidnapped and sold south, it was cruel irony that placed him on his brother's plantation. The journal's final entry, dated December 17, 1844, read, "Tomorrow we make our attempt. Genevieve has secured the funds and the papers. If we fail, may this record tell the truth." Whitfield's story did not end there. Edward and Genevieve continued their cold, separate lives for years afterward, moving to Augusta at the outbreak of war. Edward died in 1865. Genevieve lived quietly until 1882, yet even death did not silence the past. In 1968, workers excavating the site found human remains near where the equipment shed had once stood. A man in his late 20s, with a single gunshot wound to the skull. No name, no marker, only silence. In the old plantation ledger, preserved today in the Georgia Historical Society, lies one final entry in Edward's unmistakable hand. Some secrets must remain buried. The honor of the name demands it. And still, on certain mornings, as the mist rises over what was once Whitfield Plantation, locals say you can see the outline of a rider moving toward the northern road, silent, determined, and forever fading before reaching freedom. By the time the century turned and Whitfield's columns lay strewn like bones across a field of weeds, the story might have faded into rumor if not for a series of small, stubborn survivals, words hidden in drawers, papers sealed behind walls, objects that refused to stop speaking. The past, it seemed, had decided on its own that silence would not be the final word. In 1954, workmen renovating an old courthouse in downtown Savannah pried away a bookshelf in what had once been a judge's private chamber. Behind it, tucked into a sealed compartment, they found a packet of letters tied with a blue ribbon faded to ash. Each envelope bore in a careful hand the same simple address, G.D. Each letter was signed only with an initial. Arkansas County records identified the judge who once sat there, William Harrington, who presided over a litany of property disputes in the 1840s, including cases that quietly intersected with the Duffrain Circle. His journal, held today in the local archives, mentioned a distant family link to the Whitfield line through marriage. Now and then he wrote of delicacies of reputation, an elegant phrase for problems that could ruin the wrong name at the wrong moment. The letters, preserved in acid-free folders and studied by careful hands, carried a voice the archivists already suspected they knew. The handwriting matched what survived of the journal found in the collapsed shed in 1868. It was Noah's. "My dearest G," the first letter began, "I write knowing these words cannot reach you, yet I am compelled to set them down, as if the telling itself were a kind of breath." Dated February 3, 1845. It described a night unlike the one enshrined in the sheriff's report. He wrote of the confrontation at the shed, the gun, the storm, the heat of anger held taut as wire, and the sentence he had never imagined speaking aloud, that he and Edward shared a father. The look on his face, Noah wrote, passed from fury to calculation the way a shadow passes from one wall to the next. He weighed the cost of truth and found it heavier than blood. What followed in the letter ran contrary to every official account. Instead of a shot meant to kill, Noah described a shot fired into the ground. Sound and spectacle without the wound. Proof enough for a story that would stand. There, in the muddied straw and the hammering rain, Edward proposed an arrangement. Noah would vanish. Edward would report the escape and perform the rituals of outrage, publish notices, direct inquiries down dead-end roads. He would provide the funds and the means for Noah to disappear far from Georgia, under a new name. The price was silence. Silence about their father, silence about the marriage, silence about the night. Reputation, Noah wrote, was the only altar at which he truly knelt. He did not forgive Edward for that. He simply understood it. The second letter, dated April 10, 1845, carried a new signature beneath the familiar closing, Nathan Lewis. In Cincinnati, north enough to breathe, he had taken work at a printing house that asked no questions so long as the presses ran on time. He learned the rhythm of machines and the weight of ink. He learned, too, the strange irony of setting type for advertisements that once would have hunted him. Rewards for a man described in measurements and scars. There is a quiet in this city, he wrote, that feels almost like forgiveness. He worried for Genevieve. The letters returned to her again and again, not in romance but in shared witness. I do not ask whether he punishes you, he wrote. I ask whether the greater punishment is the life of performance. Two people behind one door, each keeping theater with the other. He had no answer for her future, only the hope that the past might one day be acknowledged as more than rumor. The letters continued through 1847, spanning small triumphs and practical nightmares. He rented rooms, moved closer to the print shop, joined other men for cheap dinners and long walks along the river, spoke little about where he'd been. Now and then he hinted at legal advice sought and abandoned, perhaps sent to Judge Harrington, perhaps never delivered. There are truths that can free a man and truths that can destroy him, he wrote. I have not yet decided which kind ours must be. The final letter, dated November 12, 1847, contained a note like a door closing softly. Word reached him that the Duffrains were leaving Whitfield for Augusta, that Edward's fortune was faltering, that the marriage continued in name rather than in life. I will not write again, he said. Let these pages stand in my place. If the world one day reads them, let it be when those who would be injured by them have long since found their rest. He signed, as always, with a single letter. How those unsent letters came to rest in a judge's hidden chamber remains a strand of the story that refuses to straighten. One theory holds that Noah, fearing discovery or doubt, had gathered his courage to seek acknowledgement of his parentage and then lost heart. The packet never posted. Another imagines Edward, in a turn both ruthless and oddly protective, intercepting the letters and placing them with someone skilled in quiet counsel. Either way, the words survived. Sometimes that is the only miracle history offers. The river kept its own counsel. In 2004, dredging along the Savannah harbor pulled from the silt a small leather satchel sealed by time and mud. Inside were a shaving kit, several gold coins, and a packet of letters addressed to Nathan Lewis in Cincinnati. The hand matched Genevieve's. Salt and age had made the paper fragile as dust. Archivists, working with patience that borders on love, placed the letters in controlled light and thinking silence. They have not yet been read. The river is patient and preservation takes time measured not in days but in breaths. The story, meanwhile, doubled back on itself in other places. In the 1920s, a storm tore Whitfield's carcass to pieces. When crews sifted the wreckage, they found a small portrait miniature of a young woman in a blue dress. Genevieve in youth, hair dark, gaze steady. It went to the museum, where a conservator in 1972 opened the frame and discovered another secret. A scrap of paper pressed behind the portrait, words written in a fine hand that had fought to remain legible against the years. Some cages have invisible bars. It was the sort of sentence that sounds plain until it is set beside a life. Genevieve's years after Whitfield left few dramatic marks, only the steady lines of routine. In Augusta, she attended services at St. Paul's, volunteered for widows and orphans, and spoke little of her marriage. After Edward's death in 1865, she returned to Charleston, lived with her widowed sister, and went about in the world like a shadow that chose to be slender. When she died in 1882 at 58, the will she left behind contained an odd bequest: $500 to the Cincinnati Printers Benevolent Society, anonymously directed. No record suggests she ever visited Cincinnati. Still, the money traveled its own quiet road, as money sometimes does, toward a place where a man named Nathan Lewis once set type late into winter evenings. The bones under Whitfield also had their say. In 1968, as the land was carved into lots and assigned street names that made gentility of what had broken there: Whitfield Estates, Duffrain Drive, Plantation Way, workers uncovered human remains near the old equipment shed. The body belonged to a man in his late 20s or early 30s, roughly the age Noah would have been in 1844. A single gunshot wound visible at the skull. The conclusion came quickly. This must have been the fugitive felled in his flight. But the land was not finished muddying the story. The man's few effects included a small brass key like those used for personal trunks in the mid-19th century, and nearby in 1966, a locked metal box was unearthed 45 yards from the same spot. When forced open, it held a pocket watch engraved ED, a folded document that crumbled at touch, and a second portrait of Genevieve, this one slashed and dented as if someone had struck it in rage. Speculation flared. Some whispered that the body belonged to Edward after all, but Augusta's records answered calmly. Business transactions, tax entries, and church logs placed him alive there between 1861 and 1865. If the bones were not his, then whose? And why carry Edward's watch? The fragmentary document, painstakingly preserved, yielded only a handful of phrases: rightful claim, paternal acknowledgement, equal division of estate, perhaps a draft, perhaps a threat, perhaps the very thing that drove 3 people into a night from which none of them quite returned. There were other traces, small, undecidable, human. In 1965, an elderly woman appeared at a local meeting and said she descended from Martha, the head house servant who once watched everything and wrote almost nothing. She swore that neither Edward nor Noah died that night, that the gunshot split the air, not a man, that the struggle produced revelation instead of blood. She said Edward learned the truth in that hour and bargained with it. Historians shook their heads, no documents, no proof. Still, some glanced at the ledger of 1845 and noted, not without unease, Edward's 2-week absence in January, certain unusual withdrawals, letters guarded by euphemisms, a family matter requiring discretion. Such shadows are not certainty, but they keep certainty honest. By 2015, a team running ground-penetrating radar over the former plantation grounds, work meant to map the past respectfully as the neighborhood pressed in, found what earlier records had not marked: a small burial ground separate from the known slave cemetery. The survey suggested roughly 20 graves dating largely to the 1840s. One lay slightly apart. In it, a woman likely in her 40s at death rested with a single object: a small leather-bound book whose pages were blank but for an inscription on the first leaf. The writing had suffered the long, slow fire of time, but one phrase could be made out: to remember what cannot be spoken. Scholars argued about her identity. A confidant? A witness? A person who knew enough to know that writing it down would be dangerous, and enough to insist that forgetting was worse? Across Savannah, the river made its quiet offerings and kept its quieter secrets. A Cincinnati obituary from 1868 recorded the death of a man named Nathan Lewis, a printer, respected in his community, about 50 years of age, with no known family. He was buried under a modest stone, the dates uncertain, the epitaph certain and spare. Freedom once gained is never forgotten. Whether the phrase described an escape from bondage or the escape from something subtler, the decision not to live beneath another person's silence, no one could say. Those who had known him at the shop spoke of dignity and a gravity in his step, as though he carried weight he did not intend others to lift. Back in Savannah, the living forgot and remembered in cycles. The shed where the night's struggle had played out survived longer than the main house, a stubborn ruin that children dared each other to enter until finally, In 1959, it was taken down. Inside its splintered walls, workers found marks carved into the wood, patterns some believed were African protection signs. Others claimed were navigational guides like those used by travelers following the North Star. The marks did not choose a single meaning. They rarely do. The land where the shed stood is now a small neighborhood park, a few picnic tables, a playground, a stand of trees that pays its rent in shade. There is no plaque, no marker explaining what broke there. Even so, residents sometimes pause near dusk in December and notice an odd stillness settle over the grass, as if the air itself were holding a breath. A few say they have heard the faint rhythm of hooves where there are no horses, or sensed a figure move at the edge of vision when no one stands there at all. Skeptics blame suggestion, and they may be right. Suggestion, after all, is only memory's shadow. In 1998, cemetery staff found a note pinned to the historical marker at Colonial Park Cemetery, where the unidentified remains from the Whitfield grounds had been reinterred. The paper, aged but not ancient, bore careful handwriting that mimicked an earlier style without quite belonging to it. The truth, it said, lies between brother and brother, wife and husband, master and slave. Look not for it in graves or archives, but in the spaces between what was documented and what was lived. No one claimed authorship. The note joined a small box of curiosities kept by the caretakers, things too peculiar to throw away, too irregular to catalog. If the Whitfield mystery has a lesson, it may be that official stories are scaffolds, necessary for building, insufficient for living. The ledgers list 73 names, lives ground into neat rows of ink. The letters add sweat and breath back to some of them. The journal adds a beating heart to one. Martha's hidden notes, few but certain, change angles and light, making some facts seem strange and some rumors seem steady. And the objects, the brass key, the engraved watch, the slashed portrait, the blank book with a single sentence, the packet of river-saved letters sealed in brown silt. These are the proof that people do not live as footnotes. They try to tell us what they could not say while they were breathing. As for Genevieve, the lines that remain of her, ink on diary paper, a portrait with a scrap tucked behind it, a quiet bequest across states and years, suggest a woman who learned to move lightly through rooms and leave heavier marks where only time could find them. Her sister's letters mention that she came home changed and that no one asked her to explain. Perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps it was another kind of silence. Toward the end of her life, an attendant recorded a remark later copied into a family Bible. History is what we choose to remember. Truth is what we cannot forget, even when we try. The sentence has the ring of a thought polished by long carrying. What remains of Edward is a different kind of relic. A handwriting sample in a ledger that says, "Some secrets must remain buried. The honor of the name demands it." Whether the sentence was self-protection, confession, or threat is a question that keeps some readers awake. He was a man who believed in order, in prosperity, in appearances. Faced with a truth that endangered all three, he chose control. That choice built the stage on which the rest of the story played. And Noah, who became Nathan, survived. Survival is not glory, but it is stubborn. It is the art of waking up again. He walked the streets of a northern city under a name he chose and made products of words that once hunted him. He wrote letters he never sent and kept faith with the librarian of memory somewhere inside himself. When he died, those who spoke over him mentioned his steadiness and the quietness of a burden carried without complaint. That is not the whole of him, but it is part of the truth. The Whitfield lands, parceled and plotted and watered by sprinklers, now belong to families who mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave to neighbors at the mailbox. Children ride bicycles past a park whose soil once drank fear and hope indiscriminately. The map says nothing about the people buried beneath the paved loop. Nothing about the woman who carried a blank book inscribed with a single intention, to remember what could not be spoken. If you walk there just after sunrise on a cool morning, the Spanish moss still sways in the Georgia breeze. You can hear the highway farther off, the murmur of a new century insisting on itself. Yet beneath it all, if you let yourself listen, there is another sound. A whisper like pages turning in a closed room, like hoofbeats on packed earth, like a breath held for a very long time and then finally, gratefully, Released. The story of Whitfield endures not because every piece of it is known, but because so much of it is arranged around the spaces where knowing fails. Official records declare ownership and transfer, marriage and death. Private words tell of fear and courage, bargains and betrayals that never fit in a column. Objects bring the hand's tremor across a gulf of years. And between these, between brother and brother, wife and husband, master and enslaved, there lies the truth's wide, difficult country. People still argue about whose bones lay near the shed, how the pocket watch came to rest with them, whether the portrait's wounds were the work of rage or shame. They argue about whether Edward's staged escape was an act of cruelty cloaked as mercy, or mercy barbed with cruelty, whether Genevieve's silence was choice or necessity, whether Martha's descendant carried a memory that even paper refused. They argue about letters salt-sick from a river and inscriptions faded by air. This is fitting. History, like a chorus, needs many voices to keep a note in the air. In the end, the Whitfield mystery asks questions that no archive can answer, and every life must. What defines a family? What do we owe to the truths that terrify us? What happens when the inheritance we guard most fiercely is the very thing that unravels us? Perhaps the only certainty the story offers is a kind of courage. The courage of those who hid what mattered because saying it would kill, and of those who saved what they could, because forgetting would be worse.